Hi, folks. Welcome back into another episode of Flourish FM. We've got kind of a special episode for you today. We are chatting with Dr. Adam Wright, which with all transparency is a colleague and the co-founder of mine with the Antifragile Academy. But more than that, Adam is a world-leading expert in sort of all things mental skills, mental performance, and to a certain extent, mental health. He currently serves as the Director of Mental Performance for the Washington Nationals, but he has worked with sort of the cream of the crop across entertainment, professional and collegiate sports, business and finance, you name it. He comes from a tremendous academic pedigree with exercise physiology, sports psychology, clinical psychology, and a whole lot more, and just brings a really great perspective to all things flourishing. In this particular episode, we talked to Adam about Antifragility, which we're excited about because we're launching a new spin-off series coming up on March 5th, focused on that term. It's something that's come up time and time again in our episodes and our conversations with world-leading experts, so we wanted to double-click on it. So stay tuned for that in March 5th. But for now, our conversation with Adam Wright. John, what were some of the highlights for you?
I loved learning more about what antifragility is and its connection with other related concepts like resilience, mental toughness, and grit. And Adam gave a really interesting kind of a description of why self-awareness and self-understanding are so important for it, which at first I was struggling to kind of grasp exactly what it is, and asked him further about that. And then he teased that out further and kind of gave an account of what we might call like the anti-fragile mindset. About the main thing I took from this is how important it is when you're doing difficult things in life to approach that with an attitude of, I know this is going to be hard, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to look for ways to grow from it and so on. And that's key to antifragility. So that was my main nugget from this. Hope you guys enjoy it as well. Our episode with Dr. Adam Wright.
And stay tuned for our special series on antifragility starting March 5th. All right. So Adam, let's dive in. At this point, our listeners will have heard me kind of go through your bio. Really impressive. I want you to double click on some of these things that you are doing or have done throughout your career. But I thought we'd start with maybe the more interesting question, which you brought up in our kind of pre-meeting as well, which is like your big why, kind of why you got into this space of however you want to talk about it, human performance, human potential, anti-fragility, flourishing, thriving, right? How did all this get started for you?
It's a good question, and I think particularly now in becoming a psychoanalytic oriented therapist in recent years, I'm always fascinated by people who manage to cultivate this perfect linear career trajectory, right? And it's so neatly wrapped up in a bow, right? And when you get people in a room, you start to peel back the layers, and you see these layers of insulation that they create, are largely just false, and you see the inner child filled with fears and doubts and periods of feeling lost throughout their career and angry maybe that they lived someone else's dream and self-doubt. And so I'm always hesitant to offer that personal archaeology, but I think it's relevant because I could show you very clearly my career was not linear. I call myself a blue collar academic, and that stems from I grew up as an only child in a blue collar neighborhood in Trenton, New Jersey in the 70s. And in many ways, I'd say my life was a study in contrast from the beginning. My parents were not formally educated. My father had left high school, went into the Navy, beginning at Vietnam. My mother was intelligent, never pursued higher education. So I was one of those kids that said, "Oh, the first person to go to college." Well, I was the first person to finish high school in my father's family. And I think largely my parents were like, "What the hell do we do with this kid?" I think they were puzzled by a kid who was earmarked for these gifted and talented programs. We called them that back then. But I was also a rebel, and I would intentionally fail out of these courses. Even back then, I was resisting this predefined path. And at the same time, I was immensely drawn to these world of ideas, right? Contemplating deep topics, questioning God at 5 and doing nerdy things like coin collecting and being deep in archaeology. And at the same time, I was fiercely competitive in sport and driven in that way too. So I think paradoxically, the way I like to look at it, maybe this resonates with some people listening to the show. It's my life mirrored a scene from Goodfellas much more than it ever mirrored the atmosphere of the Dead Poets Society, right? There was no deep intellectual engagement in my house. So I think in many ways, the point of this is these juxtapositions of interests largely define me, but at the same time, there was an internal conflict that forced me to look outside of the box. And I think that resonates with me to this day. And I'll share this as an added, I've struggled my whole life with OCD. John, you mentioned some things as well in terms of perfectionism. I was painfully shy, introverted, like weird little kid who would like go in the corner and just stick my head in the corner. And like my parents would just smack me in the head and stop doing that shit. They didn't know what to do with me. But I learned to turn it around. And I really did lean into my fears, and I think in so many ways, and took action and did just the opposite. So ended up, in high school, being captain of my baseball team, most popular in my class, prom king. Not that means anything other than inside, I felt the furthest thing from that. But I did the opposite because it was values aligned. And I was doing that at a very young age. So bring me to college and career-wise, I went to college to play baseball, quickly walked away because I felt overwhelmed, ill-prepared. But I was exposed to all these ideas. I was like a kid in a candy shop. And I settled on philosophy as an undergraduate. It gave me the opportunity to think deeply about these ideas. John, you could relate to this as a philosopher. So it was useful, but at the same time, I was like, what the hell am I going to do with this? I have no money, right? And it's like, okay, well, maybe I could look at psychology, but it was always the case. I'd much rather be a character like my philosophy professors than to study character like my psychology professors, who I felt were stilted and just kind of like just boring people that I wasn't that interested in. So I chose philosophy. I knew I would not go on with philosophy as a graduate student. At the same time, like I pledged a fraternity, which was idiotic, but I also carried a 4.0. So this constant juxtaposition, upon graduation, I took a job in technology and moved to New York City. Hated corporate America the whole time. I just wanted to, if I was going to reject it, I wanted to live it. I just didn't want to talk about it. Spent a couple of years there and then quit and said, screw this, I'm done. My parents thought I was crazy. And I took a job as a trainer at a gym and said, I'm going to go back to school, and started graduate school in applied physiology at Columbia. Got really interested in that. Eventually got bored with it because physiology to me was very easy. What came more interesting to me, why people weren't following my programs, that these perfect programs that all they needed was to follow them, and they resisted and they sabotaged themselves. And somehow I found a home in sports psychology. It kind of ticked all the boxes. It's like the technology, the methodologies, this interdisciplinary study, this understanding this this complex relationship, whatever it be, mind, body, performance, like really resonated with me. I didn't even know it existed. So I ended up doing a master's in it at Temple University, and then quick stint in a doctoral program, clinical psychology. Again, didn't feel like I fit in, didn't like any of the people there. Went back to my home in sports psychology and finished my doctorate. And now later in life, went back to finish my clinical training in mental health counseling. Long-winded.
No, it's perfect, Adam. That's and that's what I was hoping you would go on some level. There's and I'm maybe all of us have talked about this at some point, but there's a great keynote or commencement speech at Stanford 2005 by Steve Jobs. Maybe both of you have seen it. Maybe some of our audience has seen it. I've shown it in a ton of talks. He basically talks about following intuition and kind of, dots will connect retrospectively later in life if you follow your intuition, right? And as you're going through your story, which of course I've heard many times in different kind of capacities, all I could think about is, you're collecting these dots throughout the course of a lifetime and professional career. And before we start talking like concepts and definitions and stuff like that, I think it's just worth rehashing these dots that really stand out to me, which is the philosophical side, the lived experience side, and that juxtaposition, the physiological background, right? I know you moved away from it, but you had some clinical training, right? The performance side, the sports psych side, if you will, right? And now I'd say, like, in many ways, you're spending more and more time thinking about that psychoanalytic, or what we might sometimes call a break fix, or the air quotes here for our listeners, fix the bad side, right? And so something that stood out to me is you're always coming at these questions from, I think, really, really well-rounded, holistic perspectives. And I think you tap into that when you think about them. So that's a long setup to kind of ask, let's start with terms, flourishing, and then we'll obviously talk about antifragility a little bit. But what do you think it means for a human being to flourish or thrive?
It's a good question. And obviously you guys are the experts in this, right? So I take a backseat to you all. But, let's think of Freud for a second in this, right? because he's just been in my mind lately. I just happened to see the movie. There's a movie with Anthony Hopkins called The Last Session. If you have a chance, check it out. He plays Freud, and he talks with C.S. Lewis about the existence of God. So he's in my mind these days. But I think he would say something like it's purposeful love and work, right? And he had pretty low expectations for the human condition. His whole goal of analysis was basically to take everyday misery and create it to unhappiness. That was the highlight of the work he would do, right? So maybe it's why he snorted so much coke to elevate his lived experience. So I think from an academic perspective, though, if we look in today's world, it's a multidimensional term, obviously, right? So closely associated with this holistic state of well-being and fulfillment. And we know, like, all of these models, PERMA and Carol Riff and Broaden and Build, and the Harvard model. I think there are common factors, right? Things like engagement, meaning purpose, achievement, positive relationships, some sense of virtue, principles, maybe even some of these concepts of self-acceptance and environmental mastery, definitely autonomy, intrinsic motivation. I think if you kind of stir that up in a bowl, you have something that looks like flourishing. And I'm curious if I could ask you guys this, because I'm curious too. It's like, okay, how is flourishing different than mental health? Right? They're clearly parallel, but it's something else, right? Because mental health is not just the absence of mental disorders and disabilities, right? It's again it's a complex interplay: emotional, psychological, social well-being. But if we add it all together, like, how's flourishing different? Is it intensity? Like, it's a foundation mental health, but is it the intensity of mental health? What do you guys think?
Yeah. My answer would be that good mental health, I would argue, would be a necessary but not sufficient condition for flourishing. Mm-hmm. So you can have good mental health but not be flourishing. Mm-hmm. Because other areas of your life could be pretty poor, but you don't have poor mental health. They're not so poor as your poor mental health, but nonetheless, you don't maybe have a strong sense of meaning or purpose in your life. Your physical health isn't that good. But you're reasonably happy. Your mental health's pretty good. You're sound mind for sure, but you're not flourishing. Your life, there's many ways in which you'd like your life to be better. So that's how I would tease out the difference between them.
What do you think, Nick?
It's a good question. I quickly kind of brought back up. I always go back to Corey Key's model here.
Yep.
Kind of mental health languishing versus flourishing. It's an interesting argument. Yeah, for our listeners, that's Corey Key's, Kayes. Yeah, really awesome model to kind of help think about these questions. Yeah,
it's called the dual continuum. Is that what's the name of the dual continuum model?
Yeah.
I should clarify.
I guess I think of it. Yeah. So I think, like, you take a term like mental health, I think that can be overly broad as well. So what my head goes to is, okay, well, what's the absence of mental health? Is it mental illness? What specific type of quote unquote illness are we talking about? If a person can navigate that illness in a way where they can still, let's say, accomplish or create or actualize some of those ingredients for a flourishing life that you kind of listed off earlier, I'm not sure why the two can't coexist, right? But I think those are probably few and far between, would be my hunch and what I understand of the research, right? So there's a little, I guess, a gap between, how I conceptualize it and probably how it actually exists in the world.
So would you say someone like John Nash was flourishing even though he's suffering with schizophrenia?
So all I know of his story is the movie, right? So if you take the movie at face value and say that is somewhat accurate, I have no idea whether it is or isn't. To me, there's an interesting question to be asked when he realizes he's dealing with what I think is schizophrenia, right? And he navigates it in a very different way. Now, is he flourishing? Well, to me, the word implies sort of like, I don't know, above and beyond baseline, some sort of element of potential. And I don't know that he's hitting that, but I think you can make the argument he was doing the best with what he got. And that might be another way to conceptualize it.
Right. The idea of actualizing potential, whatever that potential is, right? And it's also contextual and developmental. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we could build on that. To build on what I said a moment ago, A helpful definition here is, I think, actually the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard's definition that the relative attainment of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, including the context in which that person lives. Now, if someone's disposition and perhaps genetics are such that their baseline for certain aspects of mental health, like their negative affects, their proneness towards depressive disorders, is so strong that, through a lot of work on themselves and with professional support, they can reach a certain level relative to where they were, but it's their general baseline though is different to others that don't have such a high propensity towards depressive disorders. There, you might. I think it'd be fair to say that person's flourishing if, let's say, many important aspects of their life are good relative to kind of where they started off with, from, and relative to kind of how much they could improve certain aspects of their life given their proneness to depression, let's say. So I wouldn't want to say there's like an objective level of mental health for all people that you've got to reach. Rather, it's relative to the individual. And so a person could have, comparatively to some, one person compared to another, that the levels of mental health could be very different, as it were, but they could both be flourishing relative to their potential to improve their baseline in certain areas.
And this is where you come back to markers like subjective well-being as well, right?
Yes.
And all these self-report measures. And we don't need to get like too nerded out here, for the audience. But yeah, there's certainly an element of subjectivity to all of this.
Yeah, you would call it qualia, right? There's something about the lived experience, in this guy, and I think it's important. And there's a subjective nature to that. And I think what I see, particularly in my practice, and my point to this is that most people are overly critical of themselves, and they lack self-compassion. And in many ways, I think they don't recognize that they're flourishing because they don't think they have it all together. All aspects of their mental health is not there simultaneously. Emotional well-being, psychological well-being, social well-being, cognitive well-being, self-esteem, self-efficacy. It's like, it's okay.
Do you find that to be a common thread? Not all, but many of sort of what you might consider your highest performing, highest successful, sort of clientele? Because I think in our conversations in the past, like, okay, again, if we take flourishing, we say there's some sort of performance aspect, like you're crushing it in life, you're hitting these maybe external markers, which may or may not be a part of the recipe, but to the outside observer, it looks like this person's kicking ass, but their lived experience, to use your word, is maybe not such a positive one.
Yeah. I think that's probably the biggest mistake I made in the start of my career is when I came out and a newly minted PhD, and I go to work with these people, sometimes literally the best of what they do, right? The all-star, the GOAT in what they're doing, and you see that they're performing at the highest level of achievement, yet the rest of their life they are the furthest thing from thriving. In many ways, they're often struggling and going to pieces effectively. And I think I was taken back by that because I just did, that was my own ignorance. I just, I made certain assumptions that were pretty naive, and they hit it quite well until you started to peel back these layers and you get to really see somebody for what their life really does look like. So it was a great learning experience for me. Those that have it together, I think it's pretty clear, right? If you look at these markers, like what's really separating these people that are doing it right from maybe not necessarily doing it right in all aspects of their life, that what you consider flourishing, and their experience of it is such. I think I could rattle off a bunch of concepts here, but I think number one, I think they've done the work that's necessary to realize what their potential is. And that's a big one in terms of fulfilling it, because they move beyond other people's expectations. They really figure out what the hell they want for their own life, their own desire, which is important. That's a sense of autonomy and agency. I do think they have the right mindset in the sense of mental resilience. As some of these terms get old, and we know some of the problems around growth mindset and that research. But on a whole, I would say they use opportunities to learn, and they're willing to take on what we would probably say are insurmountable obstacles and challenges, right? There's something about persevering in these lines that, like all these setbacks, right? I think they are immensely clear. They have clarity in goals and purpose. Not to say it doesn't change and their motivation doesn't waver at times. They're human, but they're not just ambitious. They are super well defined, I think, and that's really important. And along with that, I think you have to have the capacity to handle stress and setbacks because it is not a linear path. And they have hopefully positive coping strategies, some not so positive, right, at times. What else do I see? I see they leverage their support systems exceptionally well. They're willing to take guidance and feedback from the circle, which is an emotional support too. I think these networks are crucial for them. They're always learning. They're always adapting. They're lifelong learners for the most part. I think they're learning from the failures, but also in terms of content knowledge too and expertise. There's an openness that goes along with this. Committed to physical health, committed to wellness, usually emotionally intelligent, depending on the field. Some not maybe not so. They're taking risks. They're accepting failures. Immense focus, concentration for long periods of time. I don't know. And all this is interacting in complex ways. It's just not simple, based upon genetics and experiences and traumas. And, people are messy. But I think these are some threads that I see that make up the tapestry of these people that I would say they have the shit together, that are flourishing.
Hi, friends. Nick here with just a brief interlude to share with you an update on one of our newest partnerships with the Antifragile Academy. Throughout John and I's conversations with many, if not most, of our guests, one thing has been made really clear. In order for people to flourish, thrive, experience the good life, they need to develop the capacity to not only navigate and endure, but ideally grow from the bad, grow from unpleasant experiences. That's why we're thrilled to be partnering with our newest sponsor, the Antifragile Academy, an organization that I co-founded with Dr. Adam Wright, Director of Mental Performance for the Washington Nationals. At the Antifragile Academy, we work with adolescent athletes, executives, and educators to help them understand some of the science, not just of optimal performance, but of well-being and anti-fragility. The ability not only to endure and bounce back from unpleasantness, but to actually come back stronger, to grow from it. Between Adam and I, we've worked with Fortune 100 companies, Inc. 300 executives, Division I programs, and elite professional athletes and Olympians from all over the world. To find out more about how you can leverage anti-fragility training, check out our website at theantifragileacademy.com.
Can I ask what the people you described, what age do they tend to be? Because the way you've described that set of attributes, it would be amazing if someone finished their education right with those attributes. But I mean, that would be a tall order to have not only identified what their skills are and their passions are, but to be really clear about them and where they want to go with. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you taught and you teach in various colleges, and you work with early career and people who are sort of further in their career, athletes in other areas. So what age do the people you described tend to be that have those attributes?
When I was going through this in my mind, I'm thinking to myself, these are people that are well established in their field. They're probably, these are people on the latter half of their field where they've already made it. I think, the younger ones are developing along that path. But these are people that are largely established and created, a name for themselves, and have been tested. They've been tested. They're battle hardened, right? I would say they're not just librarians of the mind, but they're warriors of the mind, and they have the scars to show for it.
Yeah.
I think that battle hardened is also, it's an obvious and organic opportunity to just kind of shift, the conversation and terminology a little bit. Talking about flourishing, that sounds like a certain thing. We can kind of get into the details about what it is or isn't. But I think something that all three of us have been thinking about more and more, John and I, because it's come up, probably at least half the episodes, right? You and I, through some of our work together, is like kind of prerequisites or things that are great to have as like foundations that enhance your potential to flourish consistently, right? And one of those things is this term anti-fragility. So let's just like shift it in that direction a little bit. Everything you describe or you've described to me in the past, it often sounds like these people who look like they're flourishing or crushing or have themselves put together have this sort of capacity. Yeah, they're optimistic, they take chances, yada, yada, yada. but they have this hardiness, this battle testedness, right? That has come from experience and navigating adversity. Talk a little bit about what you see in the people you work with and why that interested you in a term like antifragility.
Should we define antifragility first, just so we're on the same page and operationally?
Sure.
And listen, and as academics, we get overly caught up in these operational so let's not be crazy with it, but it's important that we're all talking on the same page.
How you think about it. Yep.
Yeah. So, and by the way, just my interest in antifragility stemmed from my interest in post-traumatic growth. I don't, so for the audience, but it was studied by Tedeschi and Calhoun back in the 90s, and they said, okay, these people have trauma. Some end up in post-traumatic stress, right, and dysfunctional, but some actually end up better off. You see improved relationships, increased personal strength, a great appreciation of life. I mean, like spirituality and seeing more possibilities is like, well, what the hell is going on there? What are these underlying processes that allow for this to happen? And they've identified some interesting ones in terms of cognitive processing and emotional regulation, most importantly, support systems, right? And some personality traits that are associated with this. So anyway, my original interest started with that, right? It's like post-traumatic. It's like, okay, but do we need trauma to engage in some of these processes, like trauma with a big T? And in sports psychology, and what I knew about like just basically training in general and theories of supercompensation, where we grow when we train, we break our muscles down and we create little microscopic tears and trauma, and we stop training and we get stronger. It's like, well, this is an interesting concept. This is inherent. This is emergent property of being human, right? This is in us. And it's like, oh, that's an interesting concept, right? So I was playing with these ideas, and all of a sudden, in I think 2012. Nassim Taleb, the trader and a scholar and SES, came up with this idea of antifragility. I was like, holy shit, this is it, right? And he talked about it. I was just like, man, he's just like singing to the choir. It's the idea that there's certain systems that thrive rather than merely survive in the case of disorder, in terms of chaos, right? Or random events and stress. So the idea is like we're going beyond resilience or robustness and bouncing back. And you're just getting better as shit gets harder, right? And when he described it, it was like so eloquently. It's like it's the property behind everything that changes with time, right? Evolution, culture, revolutions, bacteria. Like you could go the rise and fall of city. Like you can see this cultural economic success. Man, this is something that's just an amazing concept, and it's also like he proved this mathematically. It's not just a philosophical concept. So when I heard this, I was like, this is when the light came on. It's like, okay, this is something we've got to pursue. And there's not a lot of academic literature out there about it. It's a new concept. Love to do some research on it at some point, but just, thinking this through more and more and trying to understand what does this really look like in these people that are thriving, because they have access to this. And, I'd be happy to go through some of my thoughts on this process. I'm just thinking this through, but you won't.
Well,
any comments? Yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, can you just tease out a little more the relation, perhaps it's analogical, between supercompensation and antifragility? Is the idea that just like when a muscle tears in that microscopic way, it gets stronger over time, so rebuilds when someone's not training, is the idea that with certain experiences in life, after you've had them and you're processing them, maybe unconsciously sometimes, perhaps when you're sleeping, I don't know, the brain continue to work on these and build synaptic connections and consolidate the synaptic connections and synaptic pathways. There you are becoming more anti-fragile over time in an analogous way. Yeah.
And I think, this idea of cognitive restructuring and you have these pre-existing beliefs and assumptions that are challenged, and then they're reevaluated in light of this experience. And all of a sudden you come up new, and you're building yourself back and getting stronger each time. And, I think based upon that, I think the idea is like, all right, well, how do we create an internal and external milieu for this to happen, right? Intentionally.
Okay. And follow-up question, and this is probably novice question about antifragility, because I'm aware I'm talking to experts about it. Connections or differences between related character strengths, resilience, grit, mental toughness in particular.
So say the question again. Whether
what is the
how
relation?
Is it different than those? Yeah. How's it different, similar to those?
Also, how is it connected to them as well? I take it to be mentally tough. You've got to be anti-fragile.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, and yes, and yes. Can I just show? Can I paint a recipe for this? How I think about this really quickly.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So here's how I look at it. Right. It starts with knowing yourself. What are your personal characteristics? Right. Maybe we think in terms of big five personality characteristics, and we know too that like personality is not as stable as we thought. Right. We could create state change that leads to trait change, but given that there's an element of stability there. Okay. So we have to know ourselves, and then we have to build psychological skills. Right. And what I mean by that is like, what do we need to improve our functioning day to day, right? And these skills are more malleable than personality characteristics. So from a sports psychology perspective, I would say self-awareness, positive self-talk, visualizing skills, attentional control skills, relaxation, emotional control skills, goal setting, preparation, routines, all these things. So if we consider this as like the foundation of the house that we're building, and the psychological skills actually provide the bricks to build the house, what I would say is the personal outcomes that we're looking for is the actual structure that we're looking to build, right? So what does that mean? It means we want people that are, what I see is they're optimally motivated, they're self-determined, they're intrinsically motivated, they have an ability to have strong executive function, cognitive skills, they can maintain their attention for long periods of time on what matters. They can handle pressure, deal with distress. They could recognize the support around them and ask for it, whether it's perceived or real. They can manage relationships in an effective way. They have emotional intelligence. They have political acuity. They know how to work the environment. Like these are the outcomes we're looking for. Once you build that house and it's firm, then we say, okay, let's engage the world with anti-fragile behaviors. Seek more exposure to risk. Increase intolerance by taking more chances. Be willing to make mistakes of a certain kind of magnitude that's not going to sink the ship, but can actually give you data to increase and grow. Diversify your resources, cognitive, physical, emotional, all these things that like collaboration, information gathering, feedback seeking, addition through subtraction, we talk about, Nick, this idea of via activity, get rid of the bad, right? Get rid of the bad, surround yourself with the good, social contagion, building in redundancy, right? These are all anti-fragile behaviors that Nassim Taleb talks about in systems. Same thing. We could do that with our mental and physical health, with habits and routines. Does the picture make sense? How this all kind of feeds into a process?
Know yourself. Yeah, know yourself, right? Know skills and strategies, right? And then use that knowledge of self and skills and strategies to go out and take on hard things, unpleasant things, uncomfortable things to grow oneself.
Exactly. The skills and strategies allow to certain personal outcomes and abilities, right? That can be obtained. We have the potential, right? But then what do? Is go out and we test it. And we talk a lot in sports psychology about choking. What does choking mean? It's not like you eat your sport. What does that actually mean, choking? Choking means that you choke off your ability to leverage your skills and your assets under pressure, right? And this is what we want to do. If we have all these elements in place, the idea is that we can go out and we can have access in pressurized situations to our best skills that we've honed over time. In other words, here's our genetic potential, here's our skills that we've honed, and they come together like a Venn diagram under pressure. Pressure can pull us apart or it could push us together. And I feel like if we work to put these things in a mode that we can train with certain constraints given genetic capacities, that everybody has the ability to do this. I mean, this is not something for the chosen few. And I think to a large extent that the people that I see that are really killing it and flourishing are doing this. They wouldn't have this language for it. They don't even know they're doing it in many ways, but they're doing it. They embody it in a very real way.
Okay, so just let me continue just to tease these out a bit for our audience, but also for myself. So I think you've got to be resilient and mentally tough to also be anti-fragile, and probably the converse is true. You've got to be anti-fragile to be resilient and be mentally tough. I don't think you have to be gritty to be anti-fragile, resilient, or mentally tough, but I do think you need to maybe have all those three to be gritty, right? I think it doesn't work both ways, right? The self-awareness piece is particularly interesting. I don't know if you maybe need to have the kind of level of self-awareness or self-knowledge you're describing there to be resilient, depending on which form of resilience we're talking about, or mentally tough. So can we just dig in on that a bit further? Why is self-understanding and self-awareness so important for antifragility? The reason I ask this is, right, I'm imagining the resilient person is just someone that's built up a really strong sense of character that they can recover and bounce back from adversities in their life pretty well. They don't really understand why exactly. They haven't got a deep sense of understanding how they would do this. They just do it. And other people point it out to them like, wow, you're really resilient. That's really impressive in some domain of their life. I can imagine the same being the case with the anti-fragile person in slightly different ways. So can we just emphasize that? Why is self-understanding, self-awareness so important for anti-fragility?
I probably align myself with Socrates when I think about this in the sense that I don't think it's capacity. It's not possible to live a life of meaning and to flourish without some sense of self-awareness and self-reflection, deep self-reflection. I do think you could be resilient. And that's part of the equation, but it's simply not enough. And ultimately, if you look at even from a physiological perspective, if you were only resilient under stress, in time, the system will break. All organic systems will break down. If you don't allow some recovery, right, you will never grow. And I think you have to have enough self-awareness to step back over times and allow yourself to recover and to have some space. And yeah, I don't know if that happens without being able to look under hood and have some awareness. And by the way, that issue of grit is an interesting one because I always say it's like that aligns really well with high conscientiousness, and high conscientiousness aligns well with self-awareness.
All right.
If we can double click on awareness for a second, I think this is something to me has always distinguished a term like anti-fragility, but also distinguished, I think, Adam, the way you not only think about it, but the way you often practice with people you work with. Awareness of unpleasantness, let's say, right, is sort of a precondition for developing and practicing anti-fragility. Like we are thoughtfully and intentionally taking things on that are going to create some level of unpleasantness or discomfort, right? And when you hear a term like anti-fragile, it might sound like you take those things on and you experience no discomfort. You are mentally tough. But that ain't what you're talking about, right? And in your practice, you're typically never talking about eliminating or reframing or kind of putting positive spins on things. You're talking about being awareness of that discomfort and then accepting it so that you can take other actions. And I wonder if you just go down that road for us a little bit, because I think it's a really, really important nuance.
This reminds me of some of Huberman's concepts about the, as the neuroscience concepts, right? With the mid-anterior. So have you seen the, what's the name of that term? The mid-anterior cingulate cortex. But the idea with this is I would look at that as almost a willpower part of the brain. And what he's shown in some of this research is that it doesn't grow unless you know you're doing something that you do not like. Right. So if you like it and you enjoy it, it doesn't grow. Which is interesting. And I think this is something from a neuropsychological perspective is important, but even from a lived experience is important. The whole point to this is that it's a proactive searching for things that make us uncomfortable, right? We're identifying what makes us feel bad, weak, doubtful, and we're leaning into them. If you look at some of these cognitive behavioral theories, like third wave behavioral theories, like acceptance commitment theory, what you see and why they're so effective is you are never getting rid of the bad, right? You're not trying to refute all your negative thoughts and feelings. You're aware of them, you label them, you accept that they're there, and then you move forward with value-based action that's aligned with who you want to be, even though you feel like shit. So the idea is that you could perform really, really well and feel really, really bad. And that's okay because that's part of the human condition. The problem is when you avoid the feeling, when you try to dissociate from it, when you don't recognize it. I think this is probably why self-awareness, right, and some element of self-reflection is so important, because then we're basically like a leaf in the wind, right? These unconscious drivers are always there. If we don't bring them to the forefront, there will be a level of repetition compulsion where we just go and do the same thing. We're busy, but it's avoiding and we're not moving forward. You can't sit still. You're either moving towards your goals or you're moving away. And it's a very, very easy way to go back and relive like ineffective ways of engaging with the world because you really don't want to deal what's under the hood, right? It's just so damn uncomfortable. We're saying just the opposite.
Really quick before John takes us to our flourishing question, we start to wrap. I think that's kind of a nice full circle moment with your kind of personal and professional history a bit as well. I just kind of want to name that circularity.
Okay, Adam, yeah, thank you for that really helpful explanation of the role of self-awareness and self-understanding in antifragility. It makes me think that there's something like a kind of anti-fragile mindset with which we have to approach experiences in order to actually, build ourselves from them in terms of seeing these as something, things that we know are going to be difficult, but nonetheless we go into them looking for ways to improve. That's another topic for a whole other conversation on antifragility that I hope we can, have another time.
Can I add one point to this?
Go for it,
is this concept we didn't bring up, this concept of interoception, and I think it's really understanding what our lived experience is and feeling it fully. And I think that takes a multi-dimensional lens, right? It's the physical, it's having a mental approach, it's having a psychological approach. But the most challenging in all of this, and this is probably why I went back to study psychoanalytic work, which as a behavioral scientist, I always thought it was nonsense. It's like Freud was dead. He's been dead for 100 years. We go so far beyond this, but there is something about looking at emotions and funny enough, people like Sapolsky and these evolutionary biologists are telling us we're largely driven by unconscious forces. 95% of what we do, we use our brain to basically put a linear narrative around this, so it all makes sense. But the truth is it's all predetermined. They could argue that there is no free will at all. It's this is interesting stuff when it comes to emotions and really understanding what is driving us. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of reflection, and a lot of work to really understand that. And to if we even can do that, get to the bottom of it, because with that information, we can make better choices. And we can move forward with the confidence that we can take on whatever is going to come. And inevitably, we will face storms. But if we know we have no choice, I have to go this way, burn the boats, this is what's driving me, and I know why now, then it gives us, I think, a little bit more motivation, a little more conscientious, a little more grit to move forward, right? With the idea that we know, it's this is how we're going to get stronger. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
It makes sense. So what's the starting point, Adam? And we want to be conscious of and sensitive to time here. So 60 seconds, our flourishing question, or you can reframe it to anti-fragility question, but somebody's got to get started. You think there's an initial step or a most critical first step? Maybe it's self-awareness, how we increase self-awareness. You might go a different direction.
Yeah.
What do you think is most fundamental for people to get started with?
So I'll give you my shtick. All right. So here's what I say, right? If we continue to deny ourselves, right, or intentionally avoid exposure, right, to any kind of destabilizing event, and I'm not just talking uncomfortable ideas or potentially embarrassing scenarios. I'm talking about real experiences that largely shape our fundamental concept of self. We will inevitably find ourselves ill-equipped to deal with any real challenges that life throws at us, right? So the idea that we can choose to expose ourselves to experiences that in time, right, in dealing with them, will create more psychological insulation. I love that term. To deal with whatever comes our way is something, to me, worth engaging in. So how do we do that? One practical way, right? One practical way, all right? And I'm going to take this from Glasser's theory, reality therapy. We live in the world of hacks. Everybody wants a hack, right? Let's do cold therapy. Yes, there's a place for this. We can, this Goggins it becomes a verb, right? This idea of doing these crazy shit. I get it, right? And challenging yourselves. That's fine. The whole Stoic concept is beautiful. But I think the most challenging thing, the most frightening thing, right? The scariest thing is deep self-reflection, right? Looking under the hood is possibly the most difficult thing to do for any of us, right? So if that's the case, so what am I going to challenge you with? I'm going to invite you to think about a couple things, right? Question yourself. How are things right now for you? How are things going in a very real way, right? What would you be doing if you were living a life more fully? What would that look like? Project this life out 1 year from now, right? Do a future self, write this stuff down with every possible detail, right? Imagine that it's achieved, right? I want you to be able to live it. I want you to be able to feel what does that feel like? It's great. And then when you come back to the present moment, ask yourself very clearly, right? What are you doing at this time that's getting in the way of you achieving this, right? What feelings, what thoughts, what actions are moving you away? And then find one of them, just one of them, to work on and lean into and to change. And that will start to snowball.
Great.
Awesome. That's a great answer to that question, man. Love that. All right. Thank you, Adam Wright. Dr. Adam Wright. Been a great conversation. Where can people find you online, Adam?
Up until recently, nowhere, but I'm happy to say I do exist now. dradamwright.com and our work together, Nick, at the Antifragile
Adam, thanks for making the time. Really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us and your thoughts on both flourishing and anti-fragility.
I enjoyed the conversation, guys. It was glad that we happy to finally do this. It's been a long time coming.
Thanks so much, man.
Thanks so much for listening to Flourish FM. We hope you enjoyed the content. Please be sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to your podcast and on all major social media platforms.
And if you visit our website, flourishfmpodcast.com, you can sign up to our newsletter. We send out a weekly newsletter. First newsletter of every month, we share a long-form blog, and every newsletter, every week, we share highlights from our previous episodes. Please hit subscribe on our website.